Imagine that you're a data scientist, and then you as a data scientist asked to build some kind of a system, maybe a recommendation system, or maybe optimize marketing budget, or like whatever the company might need. These like systems that you build, the machine learning systems, they need to be very reliable. They need to run on the engineering systems. And this was exactly the situation that we had at Netflix as well back in the day. The question is that like, how do you help data scientists to actually use all these production systems? And that's really like what Metaflow was created for.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another month of our book club chat. This month, our book club is reading the book Effective Data Science Infrastructure. And we're very grateful to have the book author with us today. Ville is the creator of Metaflow and the co-founder of Outerbounds. Welcome, Ville. We're really appreciating you here and grateful to have you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
For anyone who joined us today, please feel free to ask questions directly in the Zoom or ask in the chat. Let's get started with a round of introductions. I'll get started. My name is Sophia. I am a data scientist in Anaconda. I'm also the organizer of this book club. Ville, do you want to introduce yourself?
Well, I think you just introduced me. So I'm Ville Tuulos. Indeed, used to work at Netflix before, leading the machine learning infrastructure team, like where we studied Metaflow. And I've been doing machine learning infrastructure way before that as well. And now CEO, co-founder at Outerbounds, where we basically continue developing Metaflow and infrastructure around it. So again,
Nice.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Anyone else want to introduce yourself? If you don't feel comfortable, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat or just like show up. That'll be even better. Hi, Blake.
Hi, I'm Blake Moya. I'm a statistics PhD student at the University of Texas at Austin and a former intern of Sophia. I was introduced to the book club, and I'm glad to be here.
Awesome. Thank you. Anyone else want to introduce yourself? No worries if you don't feel comfortable. No? Okay. Yeah, if you prefer to type in the chat, tell us who you are, that'd be great as well. I guess let's get started with some questions. I have a list of questions that I want to ask. Okay, let's get started with the first one. Since the video will be online, for viewers who are not familiar with Metaflow, could you give us a quick introduction of Metaflow?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Let me kind of paint a picture to you, maybe to answer that question. And this picture may be familiar to you. So now imagine that you're a data scientist at kind of any company today. And this company probably has an engineering team, and the engineering team has been like building all kind of like a platform infrastructure as well. But typically the engineers are not the data scientists. And then you as a data scientist, maybe you are like asked to build some kind of a system, maybe a recommendation system, or maybe optimize marketing budget, or like whatever the company might need. And as you know, these days, of course, the hope is that like these like systems that you build, the machine learning systems, they need to be very reliable. They need to run on the engineering systems. And this was exactly the situation that we had at Netflix as well back in the day, that we had data scientists like who were asked to build all kinds of business critical systems. There were engineers who had been building Kubernetes, workflow orchestrators, data platforms, all kinds of things. But the question is that like, how do you help data scientists to actually use all these production systems? And that's really like what Metaflow was created for. So basically it presents a user interface for the data scientist to access all these modern like production systems so that they don't have to know the nitty-gritties of Kubernetes and nitty-gritties of let's say workflow orchestration, and they can use plain and simple Python, not far like from what they have been doing in a notebook already, and do it in a way that like the company is then comfortable with like deploying to production and running in production. So that's, I guess, the short version.
So what's the story behind Metaflow? Like, how did you come up with the idea? And I know you created when you were at Netflix. Like, how does Netflix give you the support to build this thing from scratch and let you just do it and be so successful?
Right. Well, I mean, of course, I mean, as always with these things, I mean, you never know in the beginning. So, I mean, the kind of other parts like happen only afterwards. But here's the deal that I had been using other systems in the past. Like, for instance, there's this workflow orchestrator called Luigi that was created at Spotify back in the day. And that's something that I used in the past. And I kind of liked many parts of it. It was really nice, like when it was used in production, for instance. But one kind of Achilles heel of that system was that it was actually like quite hard to test anything locally. And of course, like with machine learning data science, like it's really important also always that like you can kind of test things locally and experiment locally, like before you even know if these ideas work at all. And now going to Netflix, they were in this interesting situation that they had almost like an infinite number of ideas how they could be leveraging machine learning and data science. But I mean, they were feeling the pain of like having that like a missing piece, that the kind of the infrastructure was there, but I mean, really it wasn't easy enough for data scientists to do any of these things. So there was a need. And now remember, like maybe some of you may remember back in 2017, which is now like how many, 5-6 years ago, you didn't have things like a SageMaker, Kubeflow. I mean, it was kind of like really early days, like for any ML ops. I mean, I guess the whole term ML ops didn't even exist back in the day. So that was the big question, that like, how do we help data scientists to kind of build these applications, experiment with these things? So it was really a real business need. So, I mean, what I really appreciate about Netflix is that they don't build anything, I mean, just like for the tech being cool or like a machine learning being cool. I mean, everybody knows Netflix. I mean, they are in the line of like entertaining people, and they do things that like really matter for them. I mean, like just kind of to drive towards that goal. And that was a real business need. And of course, I mean, there had been many smart people like kind of building parts of the stack, but I mean, there wasn't really like anything unifying. So we kind of like started building that. Of course, it was like an experiment in the beginning. I mean, testing some of those ideas that, okay, can we take the best parts of Luigi and like kind of make it easy to kind of test things locally? Can we take the best parts of like kind of the other similar systems? Can we make it easy to scale to the cloud and all those things? And then, you know, that another like really interesting thing about Netflix is that they don't have anything like a top down that somebody like a big CTO would just mandate that everybody must use this thing. But we knew that in order to this thing become successful is that it really has to be so human centric, so like user friendly, that people actually want to use it, kind of like what happens in open source as well. And that's why like we were really investing in the kind of even like things not in the code, I mean, documentation from the get-go. And then like when some projects actually like felt that actually like this is useful, this actually helps them, I mean, they of course like told their friends, and they told their friends, and then over years, I mean, we kind of got into this positive feedback loop, because basically with every new project we also heard like new requirements, we heard like new pain points, and then we were able to address those. So I think that was really amazing. So in that sense, I mean, it's of course like a massive group effort, like of course many engineers contribute in the code base, but also like many data scientists just like sharing that like what are kind of like things that are hard for them, like in their day-to-day life.
I love it. And this is open source from the day one, right? How is it? Because it's Netflix, not everything is open source, but how did you convince them to let you do open source?
Right. Well, actually, like it wasn't open source from the day one. It was like actually like we started developing it like 2017, and then it was open sourced late 2019. So it had been already used like at least like 1.5 couple of years in production at Netflix. And now if you go to github.com/Netflix, you will see that there are many projects there, actually like some that are quite popular. So the company definitely had a history of open sourcing thing and promoting open source. And of course, you can imagine that like Netflix is not exactly in the business of selling these things, so they don't have necessarily a business interest. So in that sense, I mean, it's not like conflicting with anything. So always like for any company, the big question is always about the time commitment. So we know that open source doesn't happen by itself. I mean, the communities need nurturing, like you need to provide documentation. You need to, of course, like constantly need to be responding to tickets and pull requests and so forth. So that was the big question, that how do we manage the time commitment? And I guess we just like managed to convince everybody that like, well, actually like kind of many of the questions that the data scientists outside Netflix would have are such that addressing them will then kind of help data scientists at Netflix as well, which I think has like proven to be true over time. And I think that things like that really help to make the case.
That's a great story. I love it. I love Netflix is contributing lots to open source. I love open source.
Also, the talk about dealing, I guess, on the ground with other data scientists during development as it's open source and during early development in Netflix was bringing up something that I had intended to ask for a friend who couldn't make it today, which was was it developed in collaboration with actual users? Because these kinds of tools I think are really nice to find those kinds of pain points that people are actually struggling with, rather than just the developers trying to customize something to their own workflow, and being open source and being able to really not only view the problems that everyone is having, but getting people to use the same framework. And so then they're discovering very similar problems and kind of unified workflow is really useful to the community of data science.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And that's always harder than it sounds like. I mean, like you read any like a kind of a books about product development, that they always say that, I mean, go talk to the users and so forth. But that's actually like a complex dynamic, because everybody is busy, and like kind of if you ask for feedback, I mean, it takes some energy and like really thoughtfulness to give high quality feedback. So a nice thing about an environment, let's say like at Netflix, or it could happen in academia, or like maybe it could happen at other companies as well, is that kind of everybody is working towards the same goal, that like we all like want to make these things happen, and hence we are incentivized to work together to make these things happen. And I think that was really a fruitful environment for developing these systems. And I think, like Blake, maybe another point is like about like why it is so useful to kind of work closely with data scientists, is that I think oftentimes, especially like engineers and like kind of a maybe super experienced machine learning people as well, like when they start developing systems, I think that there's always a bit of a tendency to overcomplicate things, or like kind of go after the kind of the shiniest, newest, the most exciting problem. That can we like automatically do this like amazingly auto differentiating thing in Python that like you can throw anything at it, and it's a super exciting problem. But when we work with people, it turns out that the problems that people have on a day-to-day basis are super mundane. I mean, even things that are so embarrassingly mundane that they don't even dare to talk about them, like dependency management. That like kind of everybody said, oh my gosh, I mean, how can we build the fanciest language model in PyTorch? But the first question is, how do you get PyTorch installed in your laptop? And like, it's something that like, it's so kind of embarrassing that like, you don't even want to talk about it. And that's, by the way, I mean, what I like about Anaconda and Conda is also that like, kind of, that's one of the foundational questions that we need to solve first. And that's why, I mean, like, if you look at Metaflow today, we really started with this kind of things that when you look at Metaflow, you think that, okay, I mean, like, all this is like a no-brainer, simple. I mean, there's nothing too fancy. And that's exactly by design, because those are the things that like people struggle with on a day-to-day basis. So.
Yeah, yes. I've dealt with a lot of those kinds of issues in the R community, because in academia, most of the professors that I deal with use R pretty much exclusively. And in trying to develop tools for R, and I can either make them useful for me, since I'm going to be the one executing it in the end anyway, or I can make code to share. And I have to reckon with the fact that the users that I'm going for have probably never touched Python in their life, never seen, no hate to R, but they've probably never seen a beautiful or elegant interface for mathematical computing before. And so what they would want to see is the same kind of user interaction at their level that reminds them of all these older R functions that may not be the best, but it's what they know. And then under the hood, to change everything up to make it work more efficiently, handle more volume, have you. So it's definitely hard to balance reckoning with the user you're actually going for at the end of the day, rather than if you think you know best doing.
That's right. That's exactly right. Yeah.
Going back to the environment management, I was so excited when I was reading the Conda decorator. I was like, yes, that's great. Speaking of R, does Metaflow work with R?
It actually does. So we have the Metaflow R extension, like, and like kind of going back to what Blake was saying. I mean, of course, like we work with many people in with the background in statistics. And of course, I mean, it's actually maybe still today true that if you're doing pure statistics, classical statistics, R might be still like maybe the best. I mean, arguably at least like in the top 3 in environments for doing that. So I mean, we wanted to support R. Now, the challenge there is really that there's like very few people who really know the internals of R. There are like a good number of users of R, but I mean, then like finding people who can really contribute, who can like really understand kind of the internals of R. I mean, that's definitely a smaller community. So, but yeah, no, I think like for certain jobs, I mean, like it's still like, it's a great tool. So.
Anyone else have other questions before I keep asking my questions? Don't be shy. Okay, I guess I'll just ask. So Yeah, so you mentioned Luigi, and I use Airflow a lot, also Prefect. Like, do you see all those other tools as competitors or collaborators? For companies that already use all those pipeline tools, what's your recommendations to introduce Metaflow to them and integrate with the existing systems?
Right. Well, that's a great question. Now, again, I mean, going back to really thinking, like, what are all the day-to-day needs that the data scientists have? Like, what the person, anyone like who wants to build end-to-end ML applications. If you think about it, there are like actually like a bunch of different concerns, and that's why we have this concept of a stack, the infrastructure stack, like what's in the book as well. That you kind of have to think about first. There's the kind of the very basic question, like about the data. How do you connect to data warehouses and so forth? And then like you have to think about like there has to be some way to kind of execute these functions, run compute. So you have to think about that. And then like since the compute is never like just individual functions, but I mean usually like you need some kind of like a workflow of different functions. You need workflow orchestration. And now like kind of back to your question about the workflow orchestration, specifically for that question, I mean, they have, of course, like excellent tools, like you mentioned, Airflow and Prefect and Argo workflows and Dagster and many tools. But a challenge that I have seen at many companies is that, okay, I mean, you can pick let's say like Airflow as an example, but I mean, still like you're like left with the question that, let's say, how do I do compute? And now, of course, like, let's say you can run Airflow on Kubernetes and like use the kind of the Kubernetes operator there, but now you kind of have two problems that like, well, I mean, you kind of have Airflow here and Kubernetes here, and like, how do they actually work together? And so forth. And then let's say like talking about the versioning or like kind of keeping track of like many workflows. I mean, that's something that's kind of outside Airflow as well, that I think like a problem today with many companies and many of these tools is that like you can kind of like pick kind of a best of the breed tool, like for every layer of the stack. You can use Snowflake for data warehousing, you can use, let's say, Spark like for compute, and you can use Airflow for orchestration, and you can use whatever like DVC like for versioning, and then like you use modeling libraries and so forth, and you kind of end up with 9 different tools. And of course, like typically none of these tools are like kind of they don't know each other so well. So I mean, like you as the user, you have to navigate between them, and that can be like quite challenging. So our stance has been that while we don't want to reinvent the wheel, it is useful to have a unified interface so that like you don't have to think about every concern separately. And that's why, I mean, first, I mean, like Metaflow comes with its own orchestrator, so you can test things locally. But the idea is that like once you want to go to production, it is incredibly useful to, of course, like integrate with the existing infrastructure that your company has. So let's say that like if you use Airflow, actually it will be possible, like we will be releasing support for that like really soon, that you can take your Metaflow flow and like run that on the Airflow orchestrator, or like let's say you use AWS step functions, you can use that. So that's kind of our thinking about it, that that like it makes sense to kind of integrate with kind of different tools, but not so that the user has to navigate these different layers like by themselves. And now, I mean, like most likely we won't be integrating with everything. I mean, there are like hundreds and hundreds of workflow orchestrators, but I mean, there are like a few really popular ones like Airflow, Argo workflows that we use on Kubernetes is another one, and step functions on AWS. So that's kind of like how we're thinking about it. So it's not so much of like a competitor, like rather than a component in a stack. So.
I love it. Yes, you're absolutely right. Airflow doesn't do versioning. Like you have to rely on other tools like DVC for versioning. And speaking of versioning, I feel like Metaflow UI will be a great thing to have to see different statistics of different versions, but Metaflow UI is not in the book. Why is it not in the book?
Yeah, good question. Actually, like for the very practical reason that Metaflow UI was developed at Netflix, and when I started writing the book, like it wasn't open source. It was only open source like after I guess like it was like before the book was released, but I mean then those chapters had been written already. So I mean I wish I could have covered it in the book, but yeah, no, I mean that's the simple reason. It just wasn't available at the time. So
that makes sense. Yeah, when I was first reading, I said, go ahead.
I just said there's always time in the second edition.
That's right. In the second edition. Yeah, coming soon.
Yes, please. Yeah, because when I was reading the decks, I was like, oh, I wonder if there's a UI. And it would be nice if I see the UI in the beginning, to now be like a lot easier for me to like have a visual understanding of things.
Yeah. You know, I mean, like if I might just like a comment on that. So I think that kind of touches the more fundamental question that like, why do these tech books exist in the first place? That was the question I asked like myself, that of course, like many of the libraries and systems, they kind of like move so fast that, okay, I mean, there's some feature that wasn't available at the time of the writing of the book. And then some things maybe become obsolete and so forth. So with this book, like really the idea that I had in mind that there is like some principles, like thinking about the stack, that I think is actually something that will kind of survive the test of time, hopefully, because I have seen that these things haven't changed so much over the last even 10 years, so even longer time. But then the individual details may change. So I mean, let's say today, like you may use AWS Batch, maybe tomorrow you use Kubernetes, maybe like kind of in 3 years time is something else. But I mean, it doesn't change the kind of the mental model. And I think anyone new to this field, I think it's really beneficial to have really strong mental models, what's going on. And then suddenly like everything starts making more sense, because it's not just like a random new tools here and there, but I mean, you kind of start seeing that, oh, I mean, these things actually like kind of, they have their place and they have their purpose. And it's not just like kind of like a totally fragmented landscapes.
Yes, I appreciate the book has a good balance between theory and practical code. So yeah, I really enjoyed the book. Any other questions, Blake, or?
Yeah, if you don't mind if I hit more on the balance of theory and practice, or, you know, theory versus tutorial, is that the way that you're talking about, you know, this kind of model of work, the model of machine learning design, the model of model development, is one that persists. And I think that sometimes when you know, engineers or developers get very invested in the lower level, the more literal function or computational workflow that they're doing, they forget that there is this higher level of what the community as a whole, what the data science or software development community as a whole is using, and it doesn't fit into that model. And so I think a lot of these problems, and what Metaflow I think solves well, is just interfacing between different components of a larger model that you know about Airflow, you know about you know, working with Kubernetes, with Conda, and the problem is just, if everyone knows how to use all these individually, they're going to run into a lot of trouble trying to connect them together. And so I think it's very wise to have isolated a need to interface between so many of these other, you know, interesting tools, and getting it to all fit in a model that most people already understand. So in that sense, it feels as if there's little to learn. Yeah, no, I think that's right. And that is also like really the interesting kind of like a decision that one has to make when starting to write any open source piece. And like, actually, like if you go to GitHub, you can see that there are amazing, super interesting, super sophisticated passion projects that people do that like are kind of, let's say, like starting with the premise that, okay, like all the existing programming languages suck. Let me start by creating my own programming language. And with this language, I can create these amazing abstractions. And then, by the way, you notice that the operating systems suck, and let me create my own operating systems. And then you go after that like ideal situation. And in some cases, you actually manage to create something that's super amazing and kind of like fixes like everything that's wrong in the world. But the challenge is that it's incredibly impractical for anyone else to use. And I think that that's like, to your point, exactly that kind of in some sense, you have to meet people where they are, but also help them to kind of take maybe the next step, or maybe the 10 next steps forward. And I think that that's, if you look at our industry overall, I mean, that is the story, like even over decades, that we have some things that like have been like stuck around for a really long time. And they are not perfect, but I mean, at the same time, like migrating away would be incredibly hard. And it's amazing like how much people can do by leveraging something that's old and adding something that's new, and maybe fixing the worst parts and then like adding something new. And I think that that's how we kind of like work together as an industry as well. And I think it also goes back to this idea of human centricity and empathy. That, I mean, in some like a selfish point of view, as an engineer, it might be that, oh my gosh, everything sucks. I mean, let me reinvent everything. But I mean, then like you are not exactly inviting everybody else to kind of join the journey, because also like opinions differ, and like what sucks for you maybe doesn't suck for someone else. So like finding that balance, like where you actually like trying to be empathetic, that, okay, I mean, like maybe there's a reason why these people use the tool X. I mean, like R is a great example, you know, that like R is kind of a divisive topic. And like, well, they are, like you mentioned, your professors use R. You could say that that's just old school and they don't know better, or like maybe they have their reasons. So
who knows? So.
Yeah, exactly. I think it holds true, I think, with most industries, most human behaviors, that people do what they're comfortable with. They'll follow the path of least resistance. And if you want them to take a new road, you got to pave it for them.
Yeah.
And I find that that's something that's really important with developing new tools like this. Is I think even more important than can it do, does it do anything new or interesting? Does it do it well? Is first and foremost, is it usable? And it's kind of the whole usability, the entire premise of Metaflow is this development of a better fit to an already accepted model of the machine learning development workflow.
Yeah. So, and if I may just like add one point on that. So it's not only the beginning that like you meet the users where they are in the beginning, but also like then like throughout the journey. So now Metaflow has been around internally since 2017, in open source in 2019. And actually, like the code that you had written for Metaflow in 2019 still works without any changes. And this is really important. And this is something that like applies to all open source projects. That I think like one of the biggest problems with many projects and many ecosystems is that they move so fast that you are imposing this massive migration task all the time to your users, because you are asking them to follow you all the time. And especially as an engineer, this is a huge temptation that you notice that, oh my gosh, I wish I could change that API, and you change that API and then everything breaks and you break all the users. And this is the dilemma that in your point of view, you might think that, oh my gosh, there's the technical depth and like this is horrible. But at the same time, I mean, I think oftentimes like the owners of these libraries underestimate the tax on the users, like for asking them to migrate. And of course, like one of the most famous and like infamous examples of this is the Python 2 to Python 3 migration. I mean, they like changed things in Python 3 for a good reason, but it took like 15 years for people to migrate. And I think that's why, I mean, like we are also like very adamant about the backwards compatibility of Metaflow itself, that now that you are using Metaflow, we are not going to break you. And it does cause pain. And I know that like countless of times engineers are complaining to me that, I mean, this is horrible and like we have to keep doing this. But it's part of that like empathy that, look, I mean, I know that like you as a data scientist, I mean, the last thing that you probably want to do like today is to start migrating some new API of Metaflow just because it broke. So, yeah.
Yeah, and that brings us back to how I think we began this spin-off conversation in the first place, which is that balance between theory and practice, where you know that these will stand the test of time because they are founded in a theoretical model that has already withstood the test
exactly
for at least the foreseeable future and definitely the visible past. So that I think is a thing that everyone knows they should do, but not enough people stick to it well enough. These theories exist for a reason, and this is what it is, everything we've been talking about. So thank you.
I love how easy Metaflow is for data scientists to use. Like the chapter with AWS, you just follow the instruction to set things up and you can just run your things on AWS so easily. And then the chapter 9, I think, recommendation system, where you showed to add a model simply by adding a file of the model without need to change anything else. It's just like incredible. It's just so easy. Yeah, I really appreciate that.
Yeah, no, that's great. And that's definitely the intention. And, you know, the idea has always been that I think like if you are, let's say, working data scientist at the company, there are like so many kind of worries that you have. I mean, it's kind of in some sense, it's a chill job. In some other ways, it can be quite stressful. I mean, the data is changing all the time. The requirements are changing. And I think that there can be like so much kind of like accidental complexity, what the book talks about as well, that we just like overcomplicate things like for no reason. And especially like kind of when there's so much inherent complexity in these things. And like especially like kind of anything that like relates to data, always you have a ton of things that are changing and moving, and you have to understand that at least the things we can do simply, we should be doing simply. So I mean, let's say like kind of if you add a new module, I mean, shouldn't be harder than like, let's say, adding a new file or something. So yeah, I mean, that's really the principle. And oftentimes I find myself that the kind of one of the biggest roles is actually just to convince people that, look, I mean, it's okay to stay simple. It's okay to keep it simple. Because oftentimes like people are just unsure that, oh my gosh, I mean, like kind of, isn't it almost like illegal to kind of make it so simple that like somehow it doesn't feel right? because I mean, I think it like even in education and like kind of, I guess like in other parts of the industry, there's a bit of a tendency that like kind of when things are complex, it also like showcases how amazing you are. And I think it like, of course, I mean, like your like kind of value or like the value you're producing as a data scientist should be much more tied to the actual outcomes and like not to the number of lines of code, for instance.
Yeah, exactly. And I sometimes I feel like, do I really need to learn all the DevOps stuff? Like there's just so much to learn. But then sometimes I feel like maybe with the right setup, with the right tools, I can just stick to what I know about data science. I don't need to really get into the DevOps.
Yeah. And I think like also like a philosophy is that I mean, it's also like not like a super high level abstraction saying that like you can't. I mean, that's why it's called, let's say, at batch and at Kubernetes. It's not hiding the fact that these are systems underneath. So I know some data scientists who have become really interested in DevOps. I mean, like out of their like own personal curiosity, and that's awesome. I mean, of course, I mean, by all means, I mean, nobody should prevent you from doing that. At the same time, if your interests lie elsewhere, yes, no, I mean, like you shouldn't have to learn like to write Docker files and like learn to deal with Jenkins. I mean, that probably not relevant to you at all, like if that's not your thing. So
yeah, I mean, I'm interested, it's just I'm not an expert in it, so I might not do as a good a job as some other DevOps experts. Yeah, so I have another question. What is new in Metaflow that's not in the book? I know the book has been coming out for a while and you probably started writing the book like a few years ago. So
that's right. Well, I mean, you already mentioned the UI. That's definitely one of the things. Now, the official support for all the other clouds, that as you have seen, the book only talks about AWS. Now it works on Azure and GCP as well. I mean, all the kind of principles, everything works the same way. So, I mean, it's like not a big deal in that sense. One nice thing that I wish I could have covered in the book are the Metaflow cards, the kind of the visualizations and reporting that you can embed. So that's a super cool feature that would have been a nice addition there, maybe in the second edition again. And let's see what else. Tagging. So I mean, that's something that like we released about a year ago. So you can like tag things and remove. So you can basically like you have your runs and you get the run IDs and so forth. But then you can attach like a label, like a tag, like in these runs, and then you can add and remove them. And this is really useful. Like if after the fact you can just want to label that. Look, I mean this run is the best experiment this far, or like this corresponds to the production model or something like that. So that's not covered there. Yeah, and I guess there are like a number of like other features as well. Of course, like now, I mean, maybe it would be fun to touch these topics about these kind of a cool new kind of foundation models and so forth. So all the GPU stuff, it's still a kind of a deep topic. So
where's the second edition?
That's right, second edition, third edition. Yeah.
Nice. Anyone else have questions? I'll keep asking if nobody asks. Okay. I love all the stories and all the doodles in the book. Did you draw all the doodles?
Yeah, I did. Actually, like kind of the secret story is that like kind of the data science infrastructure was just an excuse to draw a cartoon. So I knew that like kind of nobody would have published the cartoon. So I mean, I had to write all the text around it.
I love it so much. I mean, this is the first tech book that ever written, has like fun stories and then doodles. Like the doodles just add so much more character.
Yeah. No, that's fun. And I'm always a bit concerned that like some of these things, I mean, can become a bit dry. So and it's kind of and also like the other thing is that I think that like if you actually like follow the storyline, I mean, these are really like kind of the stories are like really grounded to the actual like real life experiences that I have like experienced either personally or seen other person's experience. So I really do hope that they kind of ground it to the reality, because I guess like as we discussed before about this like balance between abstract and concrete. So I think it's really, really important that there's this like a connection to the real life as well.
Any questions, Blake? Others?
Well, did we get the story yet on kind of how Outerbounds began, or what the decision was to spin off and create a whole company behind Metaflow?
Yeah, that's a great question. And now I think the really the backstory there is that we open sourced Metaflow 2019, and again, I mean, it was really quite an experiment to see like if this approach really resonates with other companies, and like since the beginning, we really like wanted to invest in the kind of the health of the community, helping people. I mean, we always have had like quite an active like a Slack where we help other companies, and just like a see that like is this something that like really resonates. And then I guess like early 2021, it had got to the point that there was a good number of companies using the system, and they were reaching out to Netflix asking if Netflix can support them. And of course, like at some point, like doing the time justification of saying that, look, I mean, we have to help all these other companies, just like doesn't make sense, like for like Netflix specifically, because they have so many needs of their own. So then there was a bit of a crossroads that we could have said to all these other companies that, look, like you are on your own, you do whatever you want, or like kind of then like we really have to basically commit and say that, okay, other people can continue focusing on the Netflix's need, and like we focus on like helping all the other companies in the world. And that's the path that we chose with Outerbounds. We decided that this is exciting enough. It seems that there's enough good momentum and tailwind behind Metaflow. And of course, like also like this is super interesting time in this industry, like with kind of many companies becoming much more mature, like with their ML and data science. And we thought that, okay, I mean, like maybe we have something to contribute, which then like motivated the founding of the companies.
Do you still code?
Unfortunately, I don't. So I mean, like what I code is that I mainly like help users, customers. So I mean, like just if there are like some examples, patterns. So, but no, I think that's a conscious decision, kind of. But I mean, Savin, like our CTO, I mean, he's of course like very actively like leading the technical development, and now we have like many more people like who are like super like experienced like at different layers of the stack. So
is that the main difference between like working at Netflix and be a CEO, that CEO has a lot more things to do?
yeah, different things. And what I really like about open source these days is that it's a whole package. I think it's always the code that kind of like somehow people fixate to. Then it's kind of easy to look at the code base and like easy to look at the issues. But if you consider any healthy open source community today, I mean, like let's say like a Jupyter Notebooks is a great example. I would argue that like maybe 60% of it relates to other things beside code. I mean, there's the documentation, there are examples, there are conferences, amazing individuals helping each other. And yeah, it's really not about the code. And that's why, I mean, I have always felt, and like what we started investing in early on at Outerbounds is also like on all the other things except the code. I mean, like especially documentation and the content. So if you go to outerbounds.com, you can find all the how-to articles, because this was always the pain point that people always have amazingly interesting kind of use cases and questions. And then like there wasn't a natural place to answer these questions. Like, how do you send an email? Like if your model training fails, or like, how do I include my own dependencies in a Docker file, or whatever it might be. So now, I mean, like we are kind of collecting that information in one place. And so that's kind of like what I really enjoy like about now doing this in a startup, that like we can kind of really approach this question holistically, like kind of thinking that, okay, how can we support the community on the content side? And of course the code is one part, like the events, like whatever else there might be. So
yeah, sounds very important. I love the sandbox playground on the Outerbounds.
Yeah, that's
website.
a great example. Great example. Yeah, that's right.
Anything else you would like to share with us before we call it a meeting? Someone said, okay, let me just read it so the viewers can know the questions. The first question is, when Metaflow was online at the beginning, Netflix, could you share some story about how did it save MLE, DS, or DA day-to-day work? The second question is, I have zero experience about ML ops. Any prerequisites to leverage Metaflow?
Yeah. Well, I mean, definitely. I mean, maybe on the first one, let's see. I guess like some of the most delightful experiences have been the ones like where, let's say, I was working with some data scientists who previously had either like work in a notebook, just in a notebook, or like maybe they had Python scripts of their own. And it was just like running on their laptop, and maybe they were getting data from some data lake, running SQL and so forth. And it was kind of small scale, and like it was kind of slow to get the data and everything. and it kind of worked, but I mean, it was clear that like it ever like couldn't handle the realistic amounts of data, and like it was kind of like uncomfortably slow, and like of course, I mean, it was nowhere near like production ready. And then I was able to work with this data scientist and sit down with them and actually like more or less like take the code that they had, take the models, nothing wrong with the models, but I mean like just like use the kind of the Metaflow patterns to access the data and especially like start running these things in the cloud. And like suddenly everything was like way faster. Like it was the same code. I mean, like all the work that they had already done. I mean, it's not that they had to rewrite anything. And like, I mean, like some people even commented that it feels that they have superpowers now, that like everything, like just like they are not stuck inside their laptop, but I mean, suddenly the world is their oyster, and they can start doing this really at the large scale, and like kind of the results became much more interesting, and like you could even like train multiple models in parallel. So kind of like seeing kind of how much more capabilities people suddenly had, and they didn't have to kind of learn like much anything new. I mean, it was and like people were really asking that, can it be actually this easy? So I think that was really a great moment there. And then like, of course, the fact after that then like when they asked that, okay, I mean, now we actually have to start producing business value. I mean, like it seems to work well. I mean, how do we actually get it to production? And then we show that, look, I mean, it's only a single line of command that you run something like step functions create or Argo workflows create, and then it just like goes to the production orchestrator. So, and like especially the fact that, you know, that there are these like organizational aspects that oftentimes data scientists are even a bit afraid that like somebody comes and yells at them that you are doing it wrong. And that we were able to show that, look, I mean, if you do it this way, I mean, nobody's going to yell at you. And they were like, oh my gosh. I mean, the previously the experience used to be that like you did your Docker files wrong, or like you didn't do the scheduling right or something. But I mean, like automatically you do it this way and like it will just work. So that was great. So, and then I guess the other question was that like about the MLOps, and then like what do you need to start leveraging Metaflow? Well, I mean, I would definitely encourage you to go to the website. You can go to metaflow.org. And like start reading the examples, the tutorials. I mean, you can just do pip install Metaflow on your laptop. So I mean, it should be like rather easy to get started. You don't need to know anything about MLOps in the beginning. I mean, it really helps actually. There wasn't MLOps when Metaflow was started. So and the idea that we have is that these projects anyway, they should grow gradually over time, kind of in iterations. So nobody, even in large companies, even if you were the most experienced MLOps person in the world, you shouldn't start a new project with the idea that you add all bells and whistles like from the get-go. Especially with something as experimental as data science and machine learning, you should always kind of like start with the simplest possible experiment that you can do to test your hypothesis. That, let's say, it could be that like you have a new model, and like you have a hypothesis that this will improve something, and like maybe you can A/B test that. Like you can just like do the simplest possible thing. You can deploy just enough to production that you can run an A/B test, and then you can see, and like, look, I mean, oftentimes it happens that like the results are not better, and you realize that, oh my gosh, I didn't think about that, or like maybe there's some cohort of users like who don't see an improvement, and then you go back to the drawing board, but you didn't waste time like on all the things that don't matter. And only after you have really proven that the value is there, then you can start adding all kinds of other things that like more model monitoring and like more reporting and like more fault tolerance and what it might be. So in that sense, like, yeah, even if you don't know MLOps today, I mean, just like go there, like read the documentation, get started, and like don't worry about like all the things that you have to do later. There's time for that.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I think we're at the time. Super grateful for you to chat with our book club today. We're looking forward to the version 2 of the book.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And like, yeah, I mean, like a parting thoughts. So definitely go to outerbounds.com. There's the Slack button. I mean, like a join community. So amazing questions. So if you have any more questions, I mean, like we have a very friendly group, like with over 2,000 people. So I mean, just like a join there and like asking more. So.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
I will post the video on YouTube and I will send you the link soon.
Sounds great. Well, thanks a lot, Sophia, for doing this.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Cool. Bye.